So hi everybody. Yeah, as Ben just said, Carlos talking from the UK, and I'll going to talk really about bioacoustics or ecoacoustics, and I tend to use the term interchangeably. I think I'm not one big one for terms. In three different elements really. So in the air, above ground, in the soil below ground, and in fresh water as well. I've had some little experience with marine, but I'm not really going to talk about that. And as I was talking to Ben, I'm just waiting for a flame-proof bioacoustics recorder to come out before we can start looking at fire habitats. But that's a talk for another day or another person, maybe. So can I get to the next slide? I'm director of bioacoustics at Baker Consultants, and I've been a conservationist and consultant for a long time. Been doing consultancy for about 22 years now, and originally came up through sort of a practical land management and wetland ecology sort of background. My sort of undergrad, postgrad work was in freshwater invertebrates and amphibians, and but as part of my consultancy work, I've been doing work on bats and just general practical consultancy type bat surveys for about the last 25 years or so. And a fairly recent newcomer to bioacoustics. I've not really been involved with the practice as a key part of my work until about 7 years ago, really. So the first published piece of work I did was from fieldwork in 2016, but since that time sort of increasingly used it in research and within consultancy, and very much, as Ben was saying, sit on the boundary between I'm 1 day a week academic and 4 days a week or 5 days a week consultants. I'm very much on the practical side of things and sort of bridging the gap between academic theory and sort of real world practice, and quite keen on developing guidance and practical uses of bioacoustics rather than looking at it just from a sort of theoretical background. So I've already said this I should have talked to this slide really. So most of my work is out doing field surveys of one sort of another for environmental impact assessments, but also doing research at the side and looking to improve the methods we use within ecological practice, nature conservation, and making use of bioacoustics or ecoacoustics as a much greater part of that, and really taking on board the potential benefits in terms of spatial coverage and long-term coverage and consistent data collection that we can get from using those sorts of approaches. So I'm just going to give you a few bit of background of some of the studies I've been involved with over the course of the years, and starting with air elements and above ground. And most of my work there has been to date has been involved in bird studies. So the first one I was involved with, following very little dabble with nightjars, Caprimulgus species, if you're in different bits of the world, was capercaillie, which is one of the grouse species that we get in the UK. It's a big turkey-sized beast of a bird that lives in northern Scotland. It's got quite limited distribution within Britain. It's only in the far north in the forest. It's already went extinct once within the UK. It died out in the 1800s, early 1800s, and was reintroduced fairly shortly after, and is currently, unfortunately, going extinct for a second time in the UK due to land change, conflicts with deer and forestry management, and climate change impacts as well, which affect the successful rearing of the young. So big woodland grouse that we get up north. It's got quite a distinctive call, and tell me if you can or can't hear this. Ben, if you can give me a thumbs up or not, it'd be great. That's what it sounds like.
You might have to share sound when
I probably need to share sound. I will describe it instead. Just imagine this. Yeah, you have this series of accelerating sort of drum roll at the start, a cork pop note, which is this low frequency thing just at 1 second in the trace above, and then the scratchy knife sharpening sort of sound towards the end that the males use, and this whole sequence is there, the display call. Capercaillies, like some of the birds, are lekking species, so they gather around and have a bit of a dance party off in the spring where the males gather in a particular part of the forest, call and do physical displays against each other, generally arrayed not too close. They're not right up in the faces generally, capercaillie, compared to other species like black grouse, and obviously do that to compete for the females, which stand around looking bored and trying to figure out which male they want to mate with, and so the vocal display, obviously quite important in terms of sort of hierarchical dominant structures and whatever within the males within an area. And some really good papers, like the one referenced at the bottom by Paula Leolo in northern Spain, which has looked at the structure of the calls of these species and found that this cork pop note, the low frequency one, down at about 750 hertz, 1 kilohertz, is related to the male size, fairly standard in terms of that. So the bigger and fitter the male is, the lower the frequency that note will be, and they found that the males, the most fit, have the best habitat in terms of their territories, and the leks that they attend are in the best habitats, and the best habitats support the overall greatest species richness in terms of the overall bird assemblage. So you can relate the frequency of this cork pop note to the species richness of birds within an area. So it's quite an interesting paper. Anyway, there are species of high conservation priority in the UK, as I said, and currently not doing well, declining, quite limited distribution, and the leks tend to be quite small as well within the UK. A big lek within the UK would be half a dozen males gathered around, in comparison to other populations in Scandinavia or in more Eastern Europe areas, where sort of 10 or 20 males would be a bigger number, obviously a bigger number, an indicator of the higher population levels in those areas. So because they are a high priority species, they get quite a lot of monitoring effort within the UK, and there's 2 survey methods for doing this at the moment. One is attending the leks in the spring. You have to be a specially licensed surveyor to do this, and the birds are quite prone to disturbance from recreation walkers, dog walkers, or from surveyors potentially as well. And so the surveyors erect a hide the day before they do the surveys, creep back under cover of darkness in the evening, wait till about 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, then stick their heads out and try to count the birds in the forest around them. So hard work, and they need to be fully at it for about 3 or 4 weeks through the season to make sure they try and cover that survey and do the monitoring over a large number of leks that they're trying to cover, and they try and cover around about 60 or 7 leks per season in Scotland. So they do that for the males in the spring, and then to get a census of males and females, they do transect walks through the Scottish forest in winter as well. And this is pretty inefficient work, because the average hit rate to bump into a capercaillie in the Scottish forest in winter is 1 bird every 22 kilometres of hiking. So a lot of work. Hats off to them for the effort that goes into this, but you don't get a lot of return for your money on that survey method in particular. So we got in contact with the people who are doing the survey work, and that's the RSPB and Forestry Commission that do that in the UK, and run a project to see whether we could use bioacoustics to supplement the survey effort they were putting in. We did that and actually conducted 2 studies, one in 2016 and one in 2017. So a small pilot study followed by a larger study the following year, when we basically wanted to see, because it hadn't particularly been done for these species before, whether unattended acoustic units could get some indication of capercaillie activity, and yes, they can. We get a definite peak in the calls about an hour before sunrise, but we can see that the levels of activity recorded on a day-to-day basis vary dramatically depending, presumably, on the weather conditions on a certain day, which can vary quite a lot in northern Scotland in spring. So some useful information out of that. We also wanted to see whether we could relate the number of calls recorded from the acoustic recorders with the number of males. So can it offer an alternative way to the standard lek counts that currently take place to try and understand the numbers of birds that are present at a lek? And with a bit of data slicing and dicing, we found that, we've got a pretty good relationship, as you can see in the top right graph here, between these different recorders and the number of birds recorded on each of the sites. So potentially we can use acoustic recorders to look at population levels on these leks. So some interesting outputs there. We also found out, purely by chance really, another slightly worrying output from the survey. So we plotted the number of capercaillie phrases recording day to day. We can see that for the 10 lek sites we were looking at in the lower graph, and just fancied having a look at what happened on the days these surveyors turned up, which are indicated by the red triangles on this graph. And you can see that for some leks in particular, if you look at the bottom left-hand corner, unit 9348, we can see that the 2 days when the surveyors turned up in April, there were pretty much no vocal activity recorded on the recorders those days. And we've got similar sort of patterns on 9558 and some of the other sites as well. So we know that the number of calls is going to vary from day to day on these lek sites based on weather conditions and also how many birds might be attending by chance on a certain day. But it seems that potentially the surveyors might be causing some disturbance on some days, and the birds may or may not be present, but they seem to be quieter on the days that the surveyors turn up, and this potentially could bias these results that the surveyors are getting in terms of how many birds they are counting, which, if we're only counting somewhere between 2 and 6 birds on a site, if we miss one, it's a pretty big percentage difference in terms of the population levels we're assessing for these pretty small sites. So a couple of papers there in terms of capercaillie studies, and this is what sort of got me started on using bioacoustics, really, and be able to get good levels of data out for long periods from fairly minimal survey effort, and certainly in comparison to some of the existing survey methods that are being used for these species on site. So following on from that, moved on to the other end of the country, so looking at heathland birds. So heather-dominated habitats, sandy habitats in the southern part of the UK, and we have a number of sites in the London area, southwest of London in England, where we have a number of migrant bird species or rare sort of resident species. So nightjar, whippoorwill, sort of cousin if you're from the States or Canada, Dartford warbler, which is the grey bird up on the top right, and then woodlark. And all of these three are protected internationally within Europe and within the UK, and we have these designated sites that are set up, protected and managed, especially for these species and the habitats that are present there. So again, another published piece of work that came out a couple of years later was looking at these heathland sites, and we had 3 designated sites. So it's sort of a complex of sites that split up into different areas. And if you can see the sort of bluey grey reservoirs in the top left-hand side of the map, right-hand side, sorry, then that's London, and we're coming down into Surrey, sort of more rural suburban areas outside of the sort of London conurbation. Had 16 wildlife acoustics SM2s available for this still back in the day. rotated those across the survey sites we were looking at to 3 different locations, so ended up with 48 sampling sites. A couple of those, well, 4 of those failed, so ended up with 44 locations being recorded, and were recorded for 6 days on each site, and then applied an occupancy modelling approach to see if it could get some greater understanding of occupancy detection rates and the general population levels of those 3 bird species across these 3 sites. And currently the conservation organisation, the government organisation, Natural England, manages these sites in association with other bodies sometimes, and carries out monitoring for these 3 species of concern, which is mostly done by volunteers, and they have a large team of about 60 volunteers monitoring these 3 birds through the spring breeding season across the sites. And again, we just wanted to see whether we could offer alternative or supplementary approaches to this. So we had the acoustic data, we rammed that together with some habitat data as well. So land cover map is the purple and green one you can see in the centre, with the detector locations marked for each of these 3 heathland sites. And we also use some Copernicus EU satellite imagery as well to get some additional habitat covariates for the area, such as forest cover, density of road networks, and those sorts of things. So deployed the units, recorded, and did a signal detection and classification process. This was pre-BirdNet, so we used the clustering algorithm within the Kaleidoscope Pro software, if anyone's used that. Came with an account history matrix, so basically looking at presence absence of each of these 3 species across a 6-day deployment period, and then use that to build occupancy models, so we could take into account detection rates. And we got some useful data. The detectability varied. Nightjar, super easy to pick up. Woodlark, moderate. Dartford warbler has quite a scratchy, indistinct call, and they're quite hard to spot and record compared to some of the other species. And we came out with some occupancy rates as well. So you can see that nightjar were recorded at nearly 70% of all the sites. Woodlark only recorded those at 16% of the survey sites we were looking at, so much more restricted distribution. And we can use that to look at the occupancy and activity levels. So this is one of the sites for nightjar, the big green map with the circles on, and you can see all the recorder sites we've got there with the red dots, and then the circles around each of those red dots indicates the number of detector days that we recorded them on out of 6, and which is the how darker the grey, the more days recorded them on, and the size of the circles indicates the number of calls recorded per each night as well. So you can see where the main levels of activity are across the site, and which areas of habitat are in use and which aren't. And we can see we've got concentrations in the northern part of the site, and then the area to the south, which is actually mostly forestry plantation rather than open habitats. There's a lot less use in that part of the site, so we can gain some understanding of the management of the site, where the best monitoring locations are for these species, and also get an indication of population levels, as we do from some of the other traditional survey methods across the site as well. So that was one major study published a few years ago. Followed up with another one which also looked at nightjar, so one of these 3 heathland birds, and there was some anecdotal reports that male nightjars in the UK have the 2 sorts of calls, and this has sort of been recorded previously from different bird species, reed bunting, and a few others. I think some of the American sparrow species possibly do this as well. But the males in these cases have a sort of pre-breeding mating attracting display that they produce, which tends to have lots of activity and lots of energy put into it, and then they have another call once they're in a pair where they're expending less energy on trying to attract the mate, and their call changes, or the song changes as a result. This had been sort of noted anecdotally for nightjars, but had never been sort of measured and proved. We did a study, well, mostly I helped out on this one. It was mostly Steve Docker's, one of my ex-colleagues' projects that looked at these nightjar calls, recorded a bunch of calls at the start of this season when the male birds were arriving, and then compared that to a bunch of songs from later in the season when paired males would be in pairs, and found out that we had, in truth, two different song types. We have a song type which goes on for long periods at the top of the screen. These tend to go for about 2 minutes or so. There's these major high frequency sequences tend to be much longer, and there's more energy invested in those, while the minor, lazier, low frequency bits in between tend to be quite short, and then the call stops dead at the end after 2 minutes. In contrast to that, there's this song type 2 shown lower in the screen, which tends to have longer minor phrases, shorter major phrases. The whole song sequence only tends to last for about a minute or so, and then the self-satisfied paired male sort of conks out at the end of this, duk, 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 and then gives himself a bit of a round applause by wing clapping at the end of the sequence. So definitely two different sorts of calls, and we think these are potentially related to whether the male is in a pair or whether it's close to a female. Certainly there was an increase in the call or song type 2 later in the season when you'd expect that. Not managed to link it to definitely known paired and unpaired males, but it's a good indication that these two things are related, which is interesting in terms of behaviour, but also potentially within the UK, where we have these designated sites that are set up and protected for this bird especially. It's pretty important to know the breeding population size, and when we're doing standard surveys, not using bioacoustics, we're recording males and assuming pretty much in all cases that they are part of a breeding pair. And so if we record 15 males singing, we assume there are 15 breeding pairs on the site. That might not be the case. There might only be 5 breeding pairs on the site, and there might be 10 bachelor males floating around unattached. So it's pretty useful information to know the number of pairs in terms of, again, management of these sites and understanding what the breeding population levels are. And so if we can use these two call types to get a better indication of the actual numbers of breeding pairs, and that's really useful information for protection of the species and management of these sites that we're looking at. So just some examples there of some of the birds studies I've been involved with. As I said, most of my work is involved with doing practical surveys for nature conservation management and environmental impact assessments, and for a number of reasons we don't tend to use bioacoustics for that. Apart from our company is pretty much the only one that's using that practice within the UK at the moment. And most surveys are still done with people going out with binoculars and clipboards and recording birds. Despite all the research that's shown there, it's probably worth mentioning to the audience that within the UK, we don't tend to use, when we're doing sort of either national scale surveys or surveys for environmental impact, we don't tend to use point counts that you make a lot of use of in the States. We tend to always do transect surveys, and you're probably aware that there's been quite a lot of research work that's done that's compared point counts done by surveyors with point counts with bioacoustics units and shown there's a pretty good overlap between. There's been pretty much nothing that has compared transect surveys done by human surveyors to point counts done by machine. So there's no really good sort of scientific basis to sort of develop this practice within the UK, and I think that's one of the potential reasons that we haven't really picked up on its use outside of scientific research so far. But we've been involved with a few schemes over a few years, and we've started to use bioacoustics more and more. So this is an area we've been working on last year, where we did some transect surveys and stuck some recorders out. These are pretty large sites, so about 5, 2 sites shown here, and there are about 4 square kilometres, 5, 6 square kilometres of upland, sort of moorland habitat, upland heath in the UK, and we stuck a couple of recorders out of the absolutely spurious minimal survey effort from the recorders, 1 recorder per square kilometre for a couple of weeks. So not a proper deployment really, but we just wanted to try and show the clients we're working with some of the benefits of using this. And this is the results we got from there. So the number of registrations that were recorded of a whole range of different species. So meadow pipit and skylark, so small passerines we get in the UK. And we saw that for those things, we got pretty good match between the number of registrations we got within the breeding bird surveys, the transects, and the acoustic monitoring we were doing, high numbers in both. Importantly though, there's the bits in orange. Some of the high priority species that we were looking for specifically in these surveys were curlew, Numenius arquata species for those outside the UK, reed buntings, oyster catcher, common snipe down at the bottom, golden plover, another specialist in these upland habitats, and we either recorded none of those or very few of them in comparison to the acoustic surveys, which picked up much larger numbers, much larger proportion of these high priority species. So even with a very, very small deployment of bioacoustics, we are adding additional species to the transect effort we were doing and getting much more high level of data in terms of volume and quality for a whole range of different species, and especially important ones that we really needed to know about on this site. So, guidance. One thing I've tried to put a fair bit of time in over the last 5 years or so is taking the research and providing guidance for consultants like me, nature conservationists, people who are maybe not so involved in the research but could make use of acoustics methods within their survey and monitoring of their sites they're managing or the species they're looking for. So produced a bit of guidance back in 2018, developing a standard protocol for bird bioacoustic surveys in the UK, which got a little bit of interest, but more importantly and more recently within the UK, there's been new professional bird survey guidance that's come out only March of last year. So this is a year old at the moment. And this did include a small section. I'm showing it, the whole of it on the screen at the moment in terms of the use of passive acoustic recording monitoring as part of a sort of a survey approach. So there's some recognition within this guidance at the moment that for some species in some locations that you might want to consider bioacoustics, but it doesn't really give any guidance on how to actually do that. So super, well, not quite hot off the press yet because it's not off the press yet, but I've just prepared some new expanded guidance for this website and the national guidance that it presents that sets out a how to go about doing passive acoustics for birds or consultancy or nature conservation. And sets out, some of the considerations and things to think about, and a sort of a starter guide on how to do that in terms of recommended times, survey effort, etc., and equipment and settings to use on there. So that's a piece of guidance that will be coming out very shortly within the UK, and hopefully expanding the use of bird surveys, acoustic bird survey within UK conservation practice. So that's birds. Just moving on to the next element now. So water, as I said, I started a long time ago. This is 35 years ago or something, maybe not 35, maybe just 30. My undergrad thesis was on water boatmen, so Corixid water bugs, and I did a immediate postgrad straight after that, looking at habitat selection by amphibians in northern France, which was later published in this sort of long-term study where we looked at amphibian decline in agricultural areas over a 38-year period. So looking at redoing surveys in 1975, 1992 when I did them, and more recently seeing how amphibian populations have fared over that period. And so after doing the work on bioacoustics with birds, sort of started to become aware of work by Camille Desjonker and Simon Link and others in terms of, and Ben, of course, looking at the use of acoustic methods within freshwater habitats, which there's very little being done on it. Yeah, what has been done sort of started in 2015. So yeah, not even 8 years now, really, in terms of the research and publication for a lot of that. Although there is some work on corixids going back to the 1970s by Klaus Janssen and one or two others. So getting back to my roots a little bit and looking at ponds. And one thing that I sort of saw when I was reading the research was that, yeah, it was all fresh and new, and what had been done had mostly been looked at a single pond or small groups of ponds, and looked at activity levels through the course of a day, for example. And I was interested in whether we could develop methods fairly early doors, to develop methods maybe, but at least propose approaches to assessing ponds across the landscape and being able to compare different water bodies. And so this is a corixid water bug, 5 millimeters long or so. We've got about 30-ish species in the UK. They're fairly diverse. They are pretty good habitat indicators in terms of water quality and the type of water bodies that they prefer. They all have fairly distinct habitat selection. They're super well camouflaged. They've got these sort of leopard prints, tiger stripes sort of things across their backs that hide them away, and live in ponds, fly around between ponds, and can occur in good numbers, and they produce sound. They do that in a number of ways, but a lot of the species, the males in particular, these are sort of the hands, forelegs, the pala, which they use for gathering food with and feeding it towards the mouth. But they have these different patterns of stridulatory pegs on their the pala that they rub across angles on their face, like a tuning fork, running a stick down railings, to produce different and characteristic sounds that are distinct to each species, because the pattern of pegs on each species is different. So when they're under a microscope, these are quite important identification features, but they produce characteristic sounds as well. Those of you who are into insect noise has probably come across Jerome Sear's and others' paper on Micronecta scholzi. Loudest animal for its size on Earth. These are 2 or 3 millimeters long and can produce sound up to 99 decibels, so super loud. These males don't produce sound using stridulatory pegs on their pala, though. They use it by rubbing their genitals across the ridges on the stomach, which is strange. It sounds painful to me. I'll leave it to micronectars to do that. But again, characteristic sounds that we can pick up. And I've stolen this graph from Simon Link and co-authors from a paper that when we are recording sounds within freshwaters, it's not just individual species we can look at. So a bioacoustic approach can obviously be taken to try and identify those, but we have a whole range of different sounds that allow you to build up an ecoacoustic picture of habitats that might be invertebrates, Hemiptera species 1, species 2 in the top right, fish calls, gronking down the low levels, but also water flows, gas exchange between the sediment and the water column, or gas exchange going through plants. So we can hear a whole range of different sounds from biotic sources as well as anthropogenic sources, whether it's boat noise and those sorts of things in some habitats as well. So it can be super useful in terms of characterizing habitats and looking for particular species. But as in all acoustics, everyone has done all their own sort of different studies in different ways, and there's not very much consistency in approach between that. And also a lot of freshwater acoustics work that has been done, and this is from Jack Greenhalgh's paper from a couple of years ago, shows that in terms of looking at freshwater habitats, yeah, out in the wild and looking for the arthropods, the insects that produced a lot of the sound there. That very little work has been done on that. Most of it has been done by recording fish in fish tanks in labs, looking at behavior. And so there's been very little work that's been done out in the wilds, looking at the ecology, conservation value of freshwater habitats, especially across landscapes. And hammering the point home, probably too much, the paper that came out from Simon Link and co a few years ago looked at the 6 steps towards making freshwater ecoacoustics really useful, and some of the points there were making data and science accessible to a whole range of different people in terms of citizen science approaches, that sort of thing. Yeah, being able to understand spatial heterogeneity across different habitat types, and trying to understand whether sounds from below the water can be used to assess habitat and ecology condition. So produced a prospective paper that looked at whether we can start to develop standard practices to allow consistent sampling approaches, range of equipment, and allow citizen scientists, recordists, habitat ecologists to work together to try and develop good databases for small water bodies, and came with a scheme that tries to do that, and going away from some traditional survey methods involving dip nets and invasive approaches to taking species out of the pond and sticking them in formalin, and seeing whether we can actually record those using fairly simple hydrophone setups instead. So we proposed a standard method for taking a single sample from a pond that can then be built up with an appropriate survey design to cover a whole range of different sites. So we didn't come up with a survey design that can be deployed across a number of ponds, but just, what is a good way to take one recording that then you can either repeat ad nauseum within one pond or can spread across a whole range of different sites. And said, 10 1-minute recordings taken from around the edge of a pond, record the metadata for the recording equipment, and record metadata that gives some information about the context as well, and linked that to some existing survey methods. So produced a field data form that people can fill in for each of these records, and relate that to information such as how permanent is the pond, what do you think the water quality of the pond is, how much shading, how much macrophyte cover, are the fish present, and those sorts of things. And then provided a Zenodo platform to allow people to upload recordings together with the metadata forms for those. And this is developing to a bit of a database of freshwater sounds. With the testing work that we did to produce the paper, we produced the biggest data set ever of pond recordings that's been published, which didn't take much effort. So I think we had about 26 different ponds covered, and that was the globally biggest data set that's ever been published on ponds, and gave some guidance on how to analyze or the acoustic indices approaches that could be used for assessing pond habitat quality, or to extract invertebrate signatures out of those, for example, or fish or whatever. We related our data set to a commonly used habitat suitability index that we use for amphibian ecology in the UK and within Europe also, and found that actually the bioacoustic index gave us a reasonably good match to this habitat suitability index across a range of different pond types. So it looks as though the ecoacoustic index can give us an indication of habitat quality for small freshwater bodies. So that's out there. Hope it's been picked up. There's some publications developing from that, and we're hoping to attract a data sharing, data set development, and for that to see if we can look at this over a larger sort of spatial scale, and potentially use it for regional surveys of small freshwater bodies. Okay, and just to finish off, that's water done. Soil. is even more fresh out of the box than freshwater ecoacoustics. I think there's very few papers on this so far. A chap called Marcus Mader, who's a composer and recording artist in Switzerland, has done a little bit of development work, and then Richard Mankin, who's based in the US, has done some work on soil acoustics, mostly looking at crop pests and those sorts of things, and sort of picked up on those and wondered whether we can use ecoacoustics as we do above ground with birds, for example, or looking at forest habitats to see whether we can record sounds underground and use that as an assessment of habitat quality or soil health, if you want to call it that. And we've had some interest in this from some agroforestry organisations. Some wine producers are interested in this as part of their soil and vineyard management. So nice work if you can get it, working in these sorts of sites. And we have just accessed a fairly reasonably sized grant to look at soil ecoacoustics for agricultural soil health assessments within the UK, and going to be working on this fairly intensively over the next couple of years with with Warwick University, close to us in the UK. And the concept is simple. Yeah, stick a microphone in the ground, record the sounds, and we don't really know what produces the sounds. Worms, yeah, millipedes, centipedes, some beetle grubs and those sorts of things, depending which part of the world you're in. Yeah, cicadas, locusts, and that sort of thing, potentially underground as well, or some mammals in some cases as well. But we can record sound, and the testing and the examples that have been published elsewhere show that this can give a good indication of soil health and is related to the number of taxa potentially. So the top left graph here with the large grey band is from Marcus Mader's paper, where he compared acoustic complexity index with taxa richness, so extracted soil invertebrates from soil where they had recorded the sound, and counted up the number of different species or taxa that they were recording, and found a decent relationship between the two for there. We know that that's going to record, well, we can guess that that might change seasonally or through the course of the day. And the lower left-hand graph with the blue line in the center of the confidence limit is my garden through the course of the afternoon, showing that the acoustic index goes up as the soil warms up during the course of the day, gets to about 6 p.m. at file number 42-ish, and then as the soil cools down into the evening, drops off again. So we get some temperature-related variation in the acoustic index we're recording. And then if we're in the colourful graph on the right-hand side, we can see we get habitat variation as well, so that more diverse the above ground vegetation is, potentially the more diverse and the more diversity of sounds that we get below the ground as well. So these are, again, soil samples from bare ground in the red box, through grass habitats, hedgerows, vine rows, and we can see we're getting some variation between habitats as well. So it does seem to be, and the initial work we're doing shows some sensible outputs in terms of being able to look at habitat quality, environmental quality, however you want to gauge that, in terms of the sounds that are produced there as well. So it's all really promising, and we're going to be doing quite a lot of work over the next couple of years to try and prove that this is usable in terms of looking at agricultural soil management or looking at nature conservation soil management as well. So a couple of study setups, mesocosm thing we were working on a couple of weeks ago on the right hand side, and then there's a paper that we've looked at restored soils in the forest example. This is currently a preprint available on BioArchive at the moment, looking at soil qualities, and we found that we could get a good picture of soil quality. Well, we compared degraded forest to non-degraded forest, restored forest, and got higher acoustic index values in the restored forest. So sensible results again, and they were related potentially to the invertebrate diversity we had in those areas as well. So nearly finished. So 3 elements covered, no fire, unfortunately, but just a plug to finish off, really, that myself and Ollie Metcalf and Tom Bradford Lawrence, who's in the audience, and a whole range of different people in the UK produced this good practice guidance to ecoacoustic monitoring, which looks at focused on sort of long-term use of acoustic indices, but potentially also targeted species things above ground, mostly terrestrial habitat. We called it in the UK because it was UK authors only, and we didn't want to, you know, make any bid for world domination in terms of the guidance we're putting in. But a lot of this will be readable and usable and applicable by people outside of the UK and Europe as well. So hopefully it's a good read, sets out, and it's intended not for, you know, experienced ecoacoustic researchers. It's intended for, yeah, conservation people, or people who might be interested in implementing ecoacoustic monitoring programs on the sites, landscapes that they're managing, and give them a good background in terms of how to do that. So it's a pretty good review, and then some concrete recommendations towards the end in the appendices. If you want to start a monitoring program and don't really know exactly the ins and outs, then yeah, head to Appendix 1. It'll tell you what to do and get you up and on your feet and running. And so that's available on ResearchGate, but also on Applied Ecology Resources, which is the British Ecological Society website. If you Google search it, I'm sure you'll find it. If you don't, tap me up and I can send you a copy. And that's me done. Thanks for listening. Hope it's been a bit of a whirlwind tour through, yeah, air, water, and soil, and hopefully we've got some time for questions. Yeah.
Thanks, Carlos.
That's okay. Do you want me to stop sharing then, or? Okay.
Let's keep it on just in case somebody's got a question related to the slides.
Okay, no problem.
Does anybody have any questions or comments? I was wondering with the soil acoustics, what do you think the ACI is responding to? Like, have you looked into the sound types that are present? And yeah, the AC.
Yes, there is a reason for choosing the ACI, I think, although the restored forest paper, we've applied a few, and NDSI also seem to give some useful outputs as well. I think what in terms of soils, it's all very low frequency because high frequencies get attenuated over super short distances. So you tend to be sampling a very small area up to about half a meter radius probably. And everything really is below 5 kilohertz and probably below 3, most of it. And we know that some species produce stridulatory sounds of one sort or another underground, so have a particular signature that you can pick up within a particular frequency band. But you also get just a whole range of sort of soil movement, yeah, worms wriggling around sort of sounds as well, which tend to be quite broadband. And so so I'm not sure whether, but this still needs to be figured out really, for a lot of the species, a lot of the sounds that's recorded, whether the spectral information in terms of frequency is that useful actually, because a lot of it tends to be broadband clicks and knocks and just sort of, yeah, like taps and people, yeah. Sounds like people moving furniture around on a wooden floor or that sort of thing. And so in terms of the general levels of activity and by acoustic activity, the time element is probably more useful in terms of, yeah, the number of peaks per minute sort of approach really. And so acoustic complexity index, because we're looking at variation along the time axis, not just in the frequency domain, I think is potentially a useful index to use compared to some NDSI just compares, you know, yeah, between above and below 2 kilohertz. Bioacoustic index is just looking at power generally within the 2 to 8 kilohertz band. And doesn't really pick up on variation along time and the dynamics of the sound, which I think is probably an important thing to be measuring within the soil environment. So yeah, I don't think anybody really knows the proper answer to that question yet. The Marcus Mader's paper, he used acoustic complexity index and he found that to be a useful index as well. So it seems to be that's a good thing, but I know there's some other work that's just counted, number of peaks per minute as a useful measure as well. So I think the time component is going to be quite important, probably, in terms of how stoppy-starty it is and how much overall sound activity there is, rather than how much sort of power density within the frequency band is potentially less useful, I think, than it is for recording bird communities, for example.
Yeah, I think you could, it'd be nice to see you. So taking the screen share off.
Right.
Nice. Viral has a question about the kind of setup to record soil soundscapes. What do you use? What can people use? Can we just stick an SM2 under a meter of soil and hope for the best?
It's probably the best thing to do with my SM2s these days. So you can obviously get a sensor underground, or as has been done for measuring sounds in dead wood, so dead timber is sort of similar, and it's sort of a biotremology approach, I suppose, really picking up vibrations in the solid, is use contact microphones, which can either go into the soil, or you can insert a waveguide, which is just a fancy name for a tent peg, into the soil and attach the contact microphone to that above ground. And so the vibrations will go into the spike that's in the ground, transmit up through the spike, and then connected above ground. So all your expensive kit, they don't have to bury. And the sort of two basic approaches to that have been done have either used contact microphones or accelerometers sometimes as well. So some of the work that's been done by Richard Mankin, they've used accelerometers for picking up sort of 3D movements. That's not quite bioacoustics then, in that aspect. I suppose it's slightly different data. It could be useful in terms of its sort of three-dimensional movements, but it's they're more expensive, they're more complicated, they're not quite so field rugged as a contact microphone, and definitely more expensive. And so contact microphone seems to be a good workable and fairly easy to apply method that doesn't cost too much, and we're recording sound data rather than 3D axis movements. So it's sort of data we're used to analyzing, and you can listen to it. So contact mic and a tent peg. Potentially useful, impedance filters and preamps, depending, and a good recorder. Because it is quiet and you need to amplify quite a lot. So if once you've boosted, I use sound devices with 70 decibel gain. So if you do that with something with a pretty shoddy noise floor, you're going to get a lot of background noise. So you need something that's quite clean to start with, because the sounds are not loud. Cool. Yeah, if anyone wants a recommendation for a microphone, I use Jez Riley French contact microphones. Is a cottage size microphone producer in the UK. You can buy, and good price and good quality as well. There are some more expensive ones though. Just bought a Schertler mic, which is 5 times as expensive. Thank you very much. That's exactly the one, Ben. So they do a good job, and getting useful data out of those for, yeah, $75, $80, $90 per contact microphone. And then an extra $1 for a tent peg. There you go. There's another question coming from Anna. The occupancy modeling. Yes. So there have been a few papers done on occupancy modeling with acoustic data. So Ollie Metcalf in the UK has done one on birds in New Zealand, and there are a couple of papers on barred and grey owls, I think, is it, in California, Sierra Nevada in the States as well. I sort of cottoned on to the use of occupancy modeling from camera trap data analysis. Actually, it was a book I was reading on analysing camera trap data that sort of put me onto the occupancy modeling thing. The basic premise is that that if you record for a number of days and see how, and if you assume that the birds are present within their territory all the time that you're recording, if you record for 6 days and record all 6 days, then that bird is pretty obvious to spot. If you're recording 6 days, you only pick the bird up 2 or 3 of the days out of there, then its detection rate is pretty low. And if that is the case, then you can use that detection rate to up the occupancy modeling. So if you recorded a bird with, let's say, 50% detection rate at 20 sites out of 40, you could say that actually I've missed it at a number of sites, and it's probably actually pleasant at 25 or 30, and I've probably missed it, although it's actually present at 5 or 10 sites out of the ones I've been looking at. So it allows you hopefully to get a better understanding of occupancy, and to allow you to develop that occupancy model, you need to record in the same way over a number of days and look at presence and absence over those. And you can do that from sort of 3 days and up. 6 days seems to be a good practical number. If you record for longer, it gets you a better detection estimate, but obviously just takes more time to do. One of the really good papers that looked at occupancy was Furness and Callas, who did the Californian bird survey over huge areas, and they developed their model based on just 3 days of recording at each site, I think. With cheap recorder in a plastic sandwich box, I think they were using, so pretty low tech, but they covered hundreds and hundreds of sites over sort of half of California. So thousands of square kilometers. So we did say 48 sampling sites, each with 6 days, and I recorded at dusk and at dawn for a number of hours, and not continuously either. I think I was recording sort of 1 minute in 5 or 1 minute in 10 sort of time sampling approach. So the level of survey output, well, the level of data set we were using was not particularly onerous to deal with. There's a certain amount of stats now, and I got somebody in to check my stats on that. So Matt Geary, who worked on this paper, has done more occupancy modeling than me, certainly at that stage. And so there is a bit of our learning in terms of the packages that are available and how those are applied properly, and the order that you do things and how to incorporate environmental covariates as well within those. So there's a modeling approach, and then we used produced lots of models and compared those to see which one worked best. And one of the issues that we found actually in So it worked in terms of getting the detection and occupancy. Incorporating the environmental variables was the bit that could have done with refining. The habitat information we had was quite large scale. So the habitat polygons were sort of in the region of 1 hectare or 2 hectares. And again, the satellite imagery data was at something like a 50-meter pixel size, I think. And so we didn't get super good relationships between the presence of these birds, their occupancy and detectability, and some of the habitat criteria, the covariates. And I think we definitely needed much smaller scale, tighter knit habitat information, sort of higher resolution habitat data as a covariates to get good relationships between the numbers of calls or the presence of species, for example, and the habitats that were surrounding them. And I think our habitat data was too big scale. And we're also slightly affected because we were working in one habitat type. I think if we had been working across a broader landscape where we had farmland and forest and heathland and whatever, it might have been more indicative. But because we were in basically a heathland habitat, the resolution of the habitat data we got wasn't enough detail to pick out differences within that overall sort of habitat type. So yeah, linking up with the habitat covariates was the main challenge, I think, or the thing that didn't work quite so well as the rest of it.
Ashik?
Can you hear me, Ben?
Yep.
Okay. Hey, Carlos, that's a great presentation. You covered a lot of ground. I have two more generic questions. One is, you talked a little bit about the interchangeability between bioacoustics and acoustic. Is there a methodological differences or potentially methodological advantages that is offered one versus another? That's question one. And second question is, there's this really interesting idea about soil health monitoring. And what appears that the range of detection might be a limiting factor. What type of comparative advantage that acoustic-based monitoring offer over traditional way of sampling soil?
Okay. Cool. I think I got those questions. So the first one, bioacoustics and ecoacoustics differences. I'm very lazy in terms of how I use terminology. I can afford to be. I'm not a proper scientist. I mean, I'm a consultant. The way I generally tend to think of it is that bioacoustics is more about animal communication and species sort of survey approaches and picking up calls, signatures of one species and comparing that to another and understanding how particular species communicate. While ecoacoustics is more to do with soundscape. So it's the sounds of all the species plus anthropogenic noise sounds and general environmental sounds like running streams or wind blowing through trees and those sorts of things. And there are differences in approach sometimes and differences in methods and potentially different people ascribe to different ones. I think one of the interesting things about using sound data is that it can be multi-purpose in a lot of cases, and if you are doing recordings of the environment, you can analyze them in a number of different ways, which is a real bonus in terms of gathering sound data that you can, from the same data set, identify characteristic species if you want to do that, and you can also get acoustic index information or wider information about ecoacoustics. So the studies we're doing for wine producers and conservation bodies and those sorts of things, where we are sticking out one set of recorders, recording through the full 24-hour cycle, and we are using that to generate a bird species list and also record invertebrates and frogs and bats at night, and also generate acoustic indices from that as well. So there are differences, but I think that there's a big overlapping Venn diagram of the two as well, that there are huge overlaps between bioacoustic and ecoacoustics approaches and the people who apply them and the studies that are there. So They're definitely not separate spheres. They're definitely hugely interlinked, I think, and a lot of the methods are very similar between them. In terms of the soil stuff, and it's how it compares to other survey methods. I think with soil, it only covers a very small area with each sample, which is problem in that you don't get much area coverage from each sample, but you don't get any overlap as well. So if you are looking to map the soundscape across a field, for example, you can usefully take a number of single samples and compare across a site very easily and quickly. Other approaches to assessing soil health are to invasively take soil samples out, dig them out, and spend the time digging 5 litres of soil out, spread them out on a mat and count your earthworms, or send them off to a lab, or take eDNA samples, all of which cost more money, probably, certainly take more time and effort. I sometimes joke, you can fit a lot of sound recordings in one wheelbarrow more than you'd get soil samples in, so it's super lightweight to carry around as well. And I think it gives you a good, rapid, easily scalable approach to assessing soil health that other methods don't give you, and potentially gives you quite a good understanding of different factors that relate to the soil, rather than doing a DNA test, for example, which is going to tell you about one species or tell you about overall acoustic diversity. Again, within ecoacoustics in soil, we can generate acoustic indices, or potentially for some species we can look for individual signatures of, maybe not species, but species groups or functional groups or broader taxa, to see if we can identify those as well. And we know that can be done for some beetle larvae, for example, and other taxa as well. So I think with any of these acoustic methods, I think, it's a lightweight, easily deployable system, gives you good broad base survey data that's easy to store, fairly easy to analyze, super easy to analyze if you're just generating acoustic indices, and can be done consistently, and you don't need sort of expertise in the field necessarily to take the samples as you do for some of the other methods. So a lot of plus points for using acoustics within soils and other environments.
Thank you.
No problem.
Okay, well, thank you, Carlos.
That's okay.
Yeah. Be curious if there are any links to soil recordings that we can hear a little bit about this underground world. I've really never heard anything like that before. So
it's not the most exciting of sounds compared to full-on bird chorus, but I can send some out if anyone wants to listen and to follow up on the meeting. So
okay, great. Well, thanks. We'll be meeting in 2 weeks' time, BioacousTalks with Sam Ross at 9 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. So see you all soon, and have a great Tuesday. So thanks again, Carlos.
Thanks a lot. And I recommend Sam to everybody. He's great. Yeah.
Cool. See you later.
Thanks a lot. Take care. Bye.